But before I come to the topic, I must say you something which will help you grow as a student of English literature, because you are the first year students. So it is imperative on my part to tell you something about how to grow as a genuine student of English literature. To know a particular age, what is important is to have the proper understanding of the age, the background understanding of the age, the background, socio-political background, religious background, and the socio-economical, historical, all these aspects have to be borne in mind to have the proper understanding of a piece of art of that particular age. So, for this, what is important is to have a chronological study of the history of English literature. You might have read so many books, but my prescription to you is to read first Hudson's book, then you switch over to Ivory Vance, then J. Long, and thereafter Ligby, and if time permits, Ligby and Kazamia. These books, if properly read in a chronological manner, you will be able to have the whole view of the English literature, which will be an asset for you throughout your career. Now, you start a book and you come to the last page or the last syllable of that book and find yourself bewildered, because every book has got a methodology to read. So when you read the history of English literature, what is important on your part is to be mindful of different trends and tendencies. Trends and tendencies have to be borne in mind, and you see what are the characteristics of those trends and tendencies. Then, who are the important writers belonging to that particular age? What are the books written by those authors? And what those books are about? This is again important. So, the important signatures of the age, the books written by those writers, and what those books are about, and then you try to find out the influences of the particular person behind the creation of literature of that particular age. This is how you can have the wholesome view of the English literature going through these books in chronological order. I would prescribe Ligby's book to you. So first Hudson, then I repeat, first Hudson, then Ivory Vance, then J. Long, then Ligby, and then Ligby and Kazamia. So far as the Elizabethan age is concerned, you know that this age is known as the flowering of Renaissance. Now, what is Renaissance? It began in Italy in the 14th century, and having its journey from, say, Germany and France, it came to Great Britain. Earlier, it was known as Great Britain. Now we have a separate country, England, Ireland, Scotland, isn't? But earlier it was known as Great Britain. And we see that in the beginning of the Renaissance in the 14th century, we have the poets like Chaucer and Langland. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and Piers Plowman of Langland. They contributed a lot to the development of the English versification. And then this Renaissance had its onward journey. But the whole of 15th century, you see that it is non-productive, no literature worth naming came to the fore. But in the 16th century, the flowering of Renaissance saw many more good literature on record. So Renaissance has its own traits. Individualism is one thing that you should know. What is individualism? That is somewhat like the identification of your own self. Man in the Dark Age did not have even the right to question. They now came to know that man is the greatest reservoir of immense possibilities. We can do something. We have the capacity and capability in us to grow higher than where we are. This understanding of the self is an important trait of Renaissance. And then is the second one is humanism. We were hardly disturbed at the sorrow of others. We became hardly happy at the happiness of others. But humanism taught us that we are the brethren. We are not just the part of the animal kingdom. We are human beings. And we should be sorrowful at the sorrow of others. We should be happy at the happiness of others. And we should come forward with possible solutions as per the exigency of the situation. This concept of brethren, this concept of individuality, that is the identification of one's own self, had tremendous amount of joy and enthusiasm among the people of England in particular and throughout the world in general. They did have the understanding of one's own self. And this is how you see that they begin to sing. And it is the humanism that is behind the popular songs and the lyrics of the Elizabethan age. Thanks to the concept of humanism thrown by Renaissance into the humankind, that the songs and lyrics and the sonnets of the Elizabethan poetry we enjoy to the core. We understood ourselves and then tried our level best to explore something which was hitherto unexplored. Many more things came to the fore, And the whole of England, every educated person in England during the Elizabethan age, they began to pen down the songs and sonnets, and whether it is the streets of England or the courtier of Elizabeth the Queen, we find that every place is buzzing with the songs and sonnets of the Elizabethan poetry. So to say, the humanists were made to choose between Pope and Luther or Calvin. You see that during the Elizabethan age, when there was a flowering of Renaissance, the idea came into the mind of the people to translate the Bible into modern English so that it may be understandable to one and all. There was a protest against that. Some people said, well, it should be translated into modern English so that it may be understandable to the people in general, while the others said that no, Holy Book cannot be translated. It should remain untouched. So this brought a feud among the intellectuals and the people in general in England. Then there was a book of common prayer having the cadences to act like poetry on the hearts of the believers. It led to the dissolution of monasteries, which affected national culture. Books were destroyed by Protestants. Schools disappeared. What was the reason? Scotland, having its own Catholicism, had its own view. Ireland wanted to stick to the old values, the tradition. And then there was a clash between the two. And the result is obvious that you see. There was some sort of social discontentment also. Social discontentment in the sense that some were very rich, some did not have the jobs. They found it difficult for life to go. But during the Elizabethan age, solutions were made. It so appears that she was having some intuitive insight and she galvanized the crack between the rich and the poor. The gulf was bridged by taxing the rich to generate what we call, say, employment for the poor. So the people in general became very happy. And for the first time during the Elizabethan age, you see that both the Protestants and the Catholics came together in the name of patriotism, love for the country of one's own. They began to sing the song of glory of the past and the present of England and it was highly appreciated by the people in general. Dream and deeds, started coming side by side. And you all may be knowing that dreams are always greater than the deeds. What I want to impress upon you is the fact that earlier you had no right even to dream for your future. Now the time came when you could dream. There was a thirst of knowledge infinite, and people wanted to know things. People came to the fore and they assembled together and tried their level best to explore the things that was hitherto unexplored. So when we talk of the Elizabethan age in general, or Elizabethan poetry in particular, we have to bear in mind the poetry of the Elizabethan age in respect of the poetry of the 16th century itself. Because you all know that the age of Elizabeth was primarily dominated by drama. It was an age of drama. Plays of different kinds came to be written by different authors. You might have heard about the university waits, Marlowe, Lilly, isn't? They prepared the way for Sexper, for the tragedy, comedy, comic tragedy, and tragic comedy. Do you know all these terms? Tragedy, comedy, comic tragedy, and tragicomedy. I explain in brief to you that tragedy is a work of art that ends in catastrophe. Comedy is a work of art that ends in happiness. Comic tragedy is a work of art that ends in sorrow, but there are elements of happiness in that. Tragicomedy is a work of art that ends in happiness, but there are some elements of sorrow in that. So we have a long history of drama written by the university waits, then William Sexper, and then the Jacobean writers. But we are not concerned here with the dramatic literature. We are concerned here with the poetry of the Elizabethan age. Then you may ask, then why did you refer to the dramatists? My answer to this question is that even the dramatists wrote their plays in the form of poetry during the Elizabethan age. So to say, the actual sensibility of the age was not drama but poetry. If you happen to read the plays of the Elizabethan age, you will find that in almost every play, there is an inclusion of some song by one character or the other. So the sensibility of the age was actually poetry. Now, I would like to refer to you one by one the writers who contributed to the versification, the poetry of the age. It was Watt and Surrey first. Watt introduced into English verse the dignity, the grace, and harmony. He attained smoothness and regularity in the form of poetry borrowed from Italy. What was the form of poetry borrowed from Italy? It was sonnet. It was earlier practiced in Italy by Petrarch. But we find that there is a great deal of difference between the Petrarchan sonnet and the Elizabethan sonnet, and for that matter, the Shakespearean sonnet. I think you must be knowing that the Petrarchan sonnet was of or is of two stanzas. First one is of 8 lines and second one is of 6 lines. 8-lined stanza is called octave and 6-lined stanza is called sestate. Now, when we are back to the Elizabethan age, and we find so many sonnets written during that age, the difference that we find in form and structure of the sonnet is that the Elizabethan sonnets do have 3 quatrains, means 4-lined stanza, and a couplet. Couplet, you know, iambic pentameter lines in which the last word of the first line rhymes with the last word of the second line. It is always iambic pentameter lines. Now the basic question is, what is sonnet? Do you know what is sonnet? Sonnet is a form of art.
A poem of 14 lines.
Yes. Yes.
It is a poem of 14 lines.
It is a poem of 14 lines. That is the Petrarchan sonnet. We are talking of the Elizabethan sonnet.
No, sir. I was talking about only sonnet.
In which 3 quatrains. This means 4 into 3, 12. Yes, and 2, 14 lines. Couplet 2, 14 line sonnets. All right. But what is the definition of a sonnet? Do you know lyric? Sonnet is a form of literature, you know, that is lyrical. And what is lyric? Lyric is the song of one's own self. The happiness and sorrow of one's own self is expressed through a lyric. So, Elizabethan sonnets, you know, it is full of lyrical charm. It is full of lyrical charm. So, we have Watt, that is the early 16th century poet. He introduced into English verse dignity, grace, harmony, and he attained smoothness and regularity in the form of poetry borrowed from Italy, that is sonnet. And he introduced in his sonnets the new lyric style to sing so many pain and happiness straight from the heart. This is lyric, to sing the pain and happiness straight from the heart. His sonnets are rich in images, metaphorical and subtle. Now again a term came, since you are the first year student, I would like to know from you, what is a metaphor? Can anybody tell me? What is a metaphor?
So when we compare two dissimilar things without using like or as, that is metaphor.
What makes a metaphor different from simile then?
So in simile we use as or like, but in metaphor we don't use it.
Because in simile also, it is the comparison between two dissimilar objects. And in metaphor also, we find that there is a comparison between two dissimilar objects. But what makes metaphor different from simile? That is what I want to know from you. So I explain it to you. Would you like to say something?
Sir, a figure of speech in which a word or phrase is applied to a person, ideas, or object to which it is not literally applicable.
Very good.
Sir, it is a direct comparison.
Metaphor is a direct comparison. Very good. Can you give me an example of that? I give you the example. Suppose you look at a girl and you say,
Sir, the camel is a sheep of the desert.
camel is the sip of the desert, okay?
The snow is the white
I just give you the simpler examples.
The snow is the
You
white
look,
flag.
you look at a girl and you say that this particular girl is as beautiful as the moon. Okay? It is simile. And when we say that this girl is moon in beauty, it is metaphor. He fights like a tiger. It is simile. He is tiger in fight. It is metaphor. So somebody rightly said that metaphor is a direct comparison, or I should call it a compressed simile. Isn't? Metaphor is a compressed simile.
Yes, sir.
Next to what is Surrey. Watt and Surrey, you might have heard the two names of the beginning of the 16th century. He followed the footprints of Watt. He ended his life on the scaffold when he was 30 only. His verse have energy and independence of Watt. He is more graceful, more sensitive, and given to elegy and love of nature. He is finer artist. In Proud Winster, have you heard this name? It is the book written by Surrey. In Proud Winster, he recalls his life there in the past, which evokes brilliant stirring picture, brilliant and stunning picture of the life of a young noble. He is known for his metrical innovations. And when I talk to you about the change in the form of sonnet, I must tell you here that it is Surrey himself who brought this change, which was later on followed by, say, even William Sexper. He gave sonnets its purely English form. He will. Is there anything wrong? Am I audible to you?
Yes, sir.
Yes, yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. He has the credit to have introduced blank verse in his translational work. So the quatrain and a couplet. Hello, good morning, sir. Professor Ashok A.K. Bachchan is here. So to say that these changes came into being because of Surrey. And it is he who brought a radical change in the prosody of English language and literature of that particular age. This innovation, I must tell you, is typical of Renaissance. Surrey's blank verse is merely a decasyllabic or heroic line without verse. Thanks to Surrey, that English prosody gained magnificent instrument, and we find so many authors emulating Surrey in their poetic creations. We have another important name, that is Sackville, Sackville, Sackville. I must tell you that he was just a link between Chaucer and Spenser. And it is Chaucer and Spenser who brought the radical change in English poetry and the consciousness among the people or the lovers of poetry. We have Gascoigne, the Steel Glass, his best work. It is a protest against luxury and time. Then Lily, L-Y. Yes. At the age of 24, he published his famous romance, Euphues, The Anatomy of Wit. You can jot down if you like, Euphues, The Anatomy of Wit. It is full of moral values. It is an attack on irreligious and immorality. It is full of wit and realism. He is chiefly known for his euphuism. Then we have Sidney, S-Y-D-N-E-Y, Sidney. His best work is Arcadia. His innovation lies in the sharpening of senses by the contemplation of plastic art. He shows a sense of line and color. He shows the effects of light and shade. These are all innovative aspects. It was novel, completely unknown to the art in English. The precision with which he drew expression and gesture is noteworthy. Stoffel and Stella depicts his despair at the lost love. His sonnets are reminiscent of the past. He abounds in expression. And thereafter we find that there are some courtier poets, a host of courtier poets. To name a few, they are Falk, Greville, Lord Brooke, Wortel, Raleigh. They were all courtier poets during the Elizabethan age. They were chiefly known for flattery. They eulogized the queen or the sovereign, and they sang a song of glory of England. Arcadia and Spenser's The Fairy Queen are supposed to be the signal for the various sonnets to crop in. It was a signal of intense literary activity. And then during the Elizabethan age in particular, we have got Daniel and Drayton. They deserve a special mention here. Daniel carries into his pure and natural verse the qualities of prose. The Civil War is supposed to be his best work, which comprises poems in various forms. There is grave serenity in his epistle to the Countess and Cumberland. His Misophilus is the name of his book, Musophilus, is a fine expression of faith in his mother tongue and its future. Daniel versifies the truth. Then we have Drayton, another brilliant poet who is reckoned to be one of the greatest poets of the Elizabethan age. He was a romanticist, both in practice and in theory. Ideas, the Shepherd's Garden, Ideas Mirror, Mortimeriedo, the Baron's War, Polyolbion are some of his notable works in various forms. His works as a whole shows fancy, fluency, liveliness, and whatnot. He was a facile versifier. His style has vigor and color. So these are some of the great poets of the Elizabethan age. I've excluded up to now Spenser and Sexper to whom I would explain separately to you for your benefit. But what is important to note here is the songs and lyrics. Elizabethans did not have the particular liking for a particular author and the, say, anthology or the collections of a particular writer. They wanted variety. They wanted poems from the common people. And these common people ultimately took to pens. And they started penning like anything. And at the close of the poem, they simply gave their initials. So we do not know the names of those writers. They are anonymous poets, anonymous poems, but written by the people of England during the Elizabethan age. Full of the lyrical charm, these anonymous poems are, and it was so attractive that the whole of England appeared to be mirthful like the chirping birds. Every educated person began to write or compose songs and lyrics. And everywhere it was buzzing like anything. So whether you are in the garden or in the street or anywhere in England, you find one song or the other being sung by the people of England. So the whole of England became a merry-go England during the Elizabethan age, simply because Elizabeth brought confidence into the people of England that their intentions, their life will be taken care of. And she actually galvanized the crack. So we see that the collection of lyrics and songs was most enjoyed by Elizabethans. Poems in the collection are mostly anonymous, as I told you. They are essentially copious, diverse, and winged. Those songs, they're copious, diverse, and winged. It shows the artistic sense awakened by humanism. As I told you earlier, that it was the Renaissance humanism that is the genesis of these songs and lyrics during the Elizabethan age. It shows the artistic sense awakened by humanism, and songs were all of all sorts, grave and gay, sentimental and cynical, came to the fore. The playwrights also composed beautiful songs as a part of their plays. They are original, spontaneous, rhythmical, and highly impressive. Now I tell you something. We have discussed almost all the smaller and big poets of the Elizabethan age, barring two. One is William Sexper, and other is Spenser. So, but before I come to Spenser and William Shakespeare, I must conclude this Elizabethan age, that Elizabethan age was full of songs and lyrics. The production of songs and lyrics in the Elizabethan age was so rich and vast that the whole of England was described as the nest of the chirping birds. English verse had already achieved fullness in the works of Sidney and Spenser. Although many forms of poetry were produced during this age, but the song and lyrics were by far the most original, and English literature of this age found its perfection in these forms. It is natural and original. Theatres, as I told you, of course, attracted the boldest and the most energetic writers, but even of these many writers turned now and then to poetry and added something to the various styles which were the delight of the age. So one is attracted to follow not the individuals, but the different political forms. However, there were two writers who devoted themselves almost exclusively to lyrics and gained good name in them. They were Daniel and Drayton, as I told you earlier. And I have already explained Daniel and Drayton. To tell you something about Spenser, he was a poor fellow, a bright poet. He had his education in England and led his life in the early part at the grudging patronage of his friends in college days. He was very knowledgeable, essentially sensitive, and a very bright star of England, known as the poet's poet. He is known as the poet's poet. This fellow was a good friend of Sidney, who was a courtier poet. So Sidney brought him to the court of Elizabeth and introduced him to her, showing the poems written by Spenser. Naturally, Elizabeth appreciated the poems composed by Spencer and was delighted to see a man as such, and announced a scholarship, or you may call it a kind of stipend, to the poet to keep on, to tide over. And he started writing the most beautiful poem that he designed in 20 books. It was he conceptualized it. I'm talking of Fairy Queen. He conceptualized this poem to be written in 20 parts. When he brought the first 3 parts of that book to show Sydney showed it to Elizabeth. It won a high acclaim, and he was given a separate place to live on and compose poems in the southern part of England. He completed the 6th part of Fairy Queen and then was progressing forward. In the meantime, there was some kind of socio-political upheaval in England, and his house was burned on fire. He somehow managed to escape from there. But many more parts written of Fairy Queen are now supposed to have been burnt in that imbroglio. But the 6 parts are available, and you see that it is beautiful, and in every respect, it is a treasure house of imagery and diction. No poet has ever held a more exalted view of dignity of his vocation. The distinctive features of his muse are the evenness and the pervading sweetness. Spencer is taken to be the painter of the varied objects and phenomenon of nature. He has shown ample skill in delineating the scenes and sights of nature. He has drawn drastic scenes in bloody fights. In his verse, we find ample descriptions of human and superhuman characters. His observations of life are based on realism. His knowledge of classical and Roman writers had widened his outlook. So to say, Chaucer and Spencer contributed a great deal to the development of English poetry. Spencer developed a peculiar style of his poetry by using many dialectic words. He used the same words in different senses. He used terms of hunting, dancing, hawking, and in archery, added to the beauty of his expression, which added to the beauty of his expression. He brought the literary English nearer to the spoken language of his. In his book, English epic and heroic poetry, Professor Dixon concludes that Spencer's credit stands the most brilliant invention of our literature. The famous stages which bear his name a measure as its history shows, comparable to blank verse in the range and variety of its harmonies. So Spencer's verse is superior to that of its lingering, to that in its lingering charm and musical sweetness. So typical sonority we find there in the poems of, say, Spencer. His Fairy Queen is supposed to be the best. Last but not the least is William Sexper and his sonnets. I'm not talking of his dramatic, say, input today or output today. I'm talking of his sonnets. Sexper, his own contemporary, said that he knew small Latin and less Greek. I'm talking of Ben Jonson. Ben Jonson said about Sexper that he knew small Latin and less Greek. Means he was uneducated. Means he was not able to differentiate between right or wrong. But after the lapse of, say, 200 years, John Dryden writes about Sexper that he needed not the spectacles of books to read nature. He looked inward and found her there. And again, in the 19th century, S.T. Coleridge writes about Sexper, others abide by, thou art not. Means the rules are made for others, not for you. You are free. You are natural. You have the intuitive insight. So others abide by, thou art not. So Shakespearean plays and sonnets are par excellence. And even in the Elizabethan age, Elizabeth might be the supreme sovereign, but the literary monarch was William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare is known as the literary monarch of England. So his sonnets, you see, are dedicated to a dark lady and a fair youth. Now it shrouds in mystery who this dark lady is and who this fair boy is. Many more speculations are there, but we can't go back to the 16th century and shake the graveyard of William Shakespeare to ask him, well, who this dark lady is and who this young boy is. So many more speculations are made. So instead of wasting our time in the identification of the dark lady and the fair youth, It is imperative on our part to see the beauty of the sonnets composed by William Sexper, and his poems, his sonnets, are the Mona Lisa of literature. It is said to be the Mona Lisa of literature, beautifully written, essentially charming, and say highly captivating. So I find that the time is for the next class to you. Thank you very much to have given me a patient hearing. And you see that the book of the history of English literature that I have prescribed to you, you must go through all those books to be the real and serious student of English literature. Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome. Welcome.
A very good morning to all my dear students.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning to